Welcome back to Conversations, the Leaky Cauldron, episode 22, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, chapters 1 through 7 on the 7th book, or we'll certainly be talking about 7 Harry Potters. And from the 2 additional people that we have on this podcast who offer an additional seemingly 7 perspectives or infinite, Ms. Sarah Miller and Mr. Wes Schantz, welcome. And thank you for joining me, and thank you for all of us joining together on this 7th part of our Harry Potter voyage.
Thanks. It's good to be back.
Yeah, good to be back.
And so I guess just back to work. And so we, Sarah, you really carried the discussion in the pre-show. You had several, I thought, very key moments from the beginning of this book that you wanted to talk about. Wes, you also wanted to talk about the epigraph some, just because I think that comes first. Maybe we could talk about that first. And then several of the points you wanted to talk about, Sarah. You were bringing up the leaving or the departing with the Dursleys. You brought up the fall of Hedwig and Mad-Eye Moody. You also brought up the 7 Potters and the differing perspectives people had on them. And I think you brought up something else too. You were bringing up a lot of very interesting things. And so probably we have enough to talk about. And so let's just dive right in. So Wes, I'm looking now at the paperback version of the American 7th book. And after several pages and the title page and then the Library of Congress page, I see on the right a dedication which looks sort of like a puff of smoke or a downward spiral in 2 dimensions. I guess my first question is, Sarah, what do you see for the dedication? And then Wes, what do you see in the dedication?
I mean, I too see the downward spiral about splitting into 7 ways. But I thought I also have the epigram or the epigraph, which comes after the chapter titles. There's like a piece from Aeschylus's Libation Bearers and a piece from William Penn essay that I'm not familiar with. Is that what you meant, Wes?
Sorry, yeah. I also am not familiar with the context of those really at all, but I do find them pretty interesting. And I think the way the dedication is set up on the page makes it kind of look like what's going on with the way that the poetry of Aeschylus is set out on the page. I don't know if that's something in the particular translation of Aeschylus she was looking at, or if she did that to make it look more like her dedication. To me, the shape that it has is more like a snake than a spiral, but I guess I see what you're saying, like the helix kind of thing going on. I guess. Or
a lightning bolt.
Hey, yeah. It's got a lot of squiggles for a lightning bolt, but I guess so, yeah. I mean, I don't know who any of those people are. I imagine that there's something really complicated about becoming a world-famous author, and that would sort of tend to make people who, are close to you that much more important, right? That they actually know who you are. This is, of course, the culmination of her long project and, something that's probably way more successful than she ever expected. And I mean, the book is enormous. The table of contents itself is like 10 pages long. But then you get these epigraphs, and I don't think that any of the other books had them. So they stood out for that reason alone. But also, they're about death, I guess. We haven't really got to that theme too much yet, as like an actual thing the characters reflect on. But we have seen some deaths already in the first few chapters, which is usually what's reserved for the books, right? But we get them right here, right off the bat. It's also a lot like, which of the books is it that it starts at the Riddle House? Maybe the 4th or 5th book. In this one, we start at the Malfoy house, right? And we see a pretty horrific scene going on there. So yeah, just a lot of death and darkness and the heaviness of like putting a big epigraph in front of your book is like, you've arrived, I feel like, as an author at that point.
It's interesting too, because it's sort of a figure of the end at the beginning, which is also at the end of this series. It's the beginning of the final book of the series. And so I also see, besides a lightning bolt and a spiral and what was it you described it as, Wes? A snake. Yes, I see it as a river too. And what's interesting about that is that if you can see the valleys and crags, as it were, the valleys and peaks. And so now in this final book, we will see the entirety of the river and how it's sort of a repeating pattern as well. And so I think that's sort of interesting. One question I had about this, besides wanting to get into death and getting into death immediately, as this book welcomes us to do, is what do you think it means that that part of the dedication here is, if you have stuck, and to you, if you have stuck with Harry until the very end? Is that to us? And why is it to Harry and not to her? Is there some idea of us all sharing a world and the world itself being more important than we as individuals are? And then, because I've been listening to this book, where are these epigraphs? I've been listening to the Jim Dale version of this audiobook, and so I haven't seen these epigraphs, nor have they been spoken. And so I don't want to be too aloof on that point.
That's interesting choice on their part to leave those out. It's at the very end of the table of contents, right before the book actually starts. I can send you a picture of it if you want.
I've got it here. I just hadn't opened the book yet because I've been listening to it. Do we want to read these? Yeah, so we have the Aeschylus, the Libation Bearers, and then the William Penmore Fruits of Solitude. Were we interested in reading these and seeing how the relationship between the text and these poems develops over the course of this final installment?
Sure. Do you want to read Aeschylus?
I would be honored.
Go for it.
Oh, the torment bred in the race, the grinding scream of death, and the stroke that hits the vein. The hemorrhage none can staunch, the grief, the curse no man can bear. But there is a cure in the house, and not outside it, no, not from others, but from them. Their bloody strife, we sing to you, dark gods beneath the earth. Now hear you blissful powers underground, answer the call, send help. Bless the children, give them triumph now. Aeschylus, the Libation Bearers.
Wow. It strikes me that the second person has shifted from you, the reader, to you, the blissful powers underground. That's kind of cool. I hadn't noticed that before.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't seem, it seems more like a curse than a prayer. It seems, it recalls to me very much Juno's invocation in book 7 of the Aeneid of Alecto, the fury from hell. If I will not be supported by the powers of heaven, I shall call forth the powers of hell. It is as if now we are supposed to enter sort of a dark, hellish underworld, that we are now going to see the full darkness of this wizarding world, which is interesting just in conjunction with the movies and how dark the Warner Brothers logo is as you go through there. If you go to the Harry Potter fan page, you can see lots of memes with that. But also just that, one thing we've been talking about just to get to the death aspect, which is of course itself a final moment in life, just as this is a final installment in a series, is now it seems like we're dealing with the biggest possible problems. The problem of evil / the problem of finitude / the problem of death and betrayal. It's like we're finally getting into the real dark meat, or what the alchemists would call the feces in which you find the stone of little worth, which is actually the philosopher's stone. And so it's like we're actually getting to the deepest possible meaning, not only of life, but also in this text. And that's symbolized even here in the beginning. Sarah, what do you see in this poem?
I mean, I see a lot of, I guess I'm not familiar with that part of the Aeneid, so I was unable to see that analogy as you just illustrated it. I am just personally struck by the first stanza more than the second or third. The language, torment and grinding scream and hemorrhage. I think the word staunch is a really powerful word, at least in English.
Mm.
I have to admit that I've read this book more often, this seventh book, so I have a sense as to why, like, how this is a relevant passage. The just a little bit more of a sense, I suppose. So I don't want to give that away or anything, but yeah, I think that this seems kind of like a pretty good summary of the various responses that we've seen, certainly Harry have towards the death of loved ones. The hemorrhage none can staunch reminds me of, like, the blood that is hard to stop coming out of, I think it's George's ear. And,
Right.
The grinding scream of death is what Harry dreamt of before he even knew he was even knew he was a wizard. And I think it's interesting, just this idea that the curse that no man can bear, for Harry right now, that is the prophecy that he is haunted by. And the idea that there's a cure somewhere from within. I don't know what to make of the second person addressing the dark gods, but this seems to be kind of an allusion to a notion that she's been weaving into the story for a while. That was my reaction to it.
I like that you resonated with the, sorry, go on, Wes.
No, I was just saying we should cross over then to the next one.
Yeah. I was just going to say that I like that you resonated more with the first stanza than the last two. I sort of did too, and I noticed sort of a connection to Cain there too. And interesting. I wonder if that curse is something like original sin, of having to make choices between good and evil, or something like that. In any case, Wes, did you want to take this one?
Okay. So death is but crossing the world, as friends do the seas. They live in one another still, for they must needs be present, that love and live in that which is omnipresent. In this divine glass they see face to face, and their converse is free as well as pure. This is the comfort of friends, that though they may be said to die, yet their friendship and society are in the best sense ever present, because immortal.
I see a lot more. Yeah. Sorry, gosh. I'm jumping in so fast. I'm so interested in this one. This one seems very much in contrast to the one before, whereas the one before has sort of a dark tone and focuses on, I would say, the sort of brutal aspects of the limited essence of time and your limited time. That is the hemorrhage, the unhemorrhaging wound I think you have, like the sands in an hourglass ever falling through. That's the blood coming from your body. But here there's an essence of immortality, like a river that kind of ebbs and flows or rolls in a scene, in a pattern over and over again. That here there's something that maybe it's almost Christian in that death seems defeated, that some things go beyond death, that some things do seem to be eternal. And even the final word is itself immortal, where the first word is death. It's as if death is itself overcome in the very order of operation within this text throughout time and even ontologically. Like death is moved away from towards immortality.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, I don't know where she got this. Like, I've never heard of this book, More Fruits of Solitude. I have heard of Penn, if he's the same one who, Pennsylvania is named after, or maybe it's the father of the Penn that Pennsylvania is named after. But anyway, what leaps out to me is the divine glass. So there's a shard of that mirror that Sirius Black gave to Harry Potter that figures pretty prominently in the second chapter. The first we see Harry in, he catches a glimpse of something in the mirror, and he thinks that it might be Dumbledore's blue eyes looking at him. I thought that was kind of cool how that also connected back to the mirror of Erised from the first book. That's a really neat, to go to the chiasmus thing, right? The mirroring that happens within the books themselves.
And even Harry remembers that, as like when he's reading the obituary, he remembers that was one time where he didn't think Dumbledore told him the truth, right?
Right.
He remembers the time where he said, "Oh, I see myself getting some socks." Just on that note of the divine glass, that's an allusion to the first letter to the Corinthians. I think it's the same chapter where Paul writes, if I speak with the tongues of angels, but I do not have love, I am a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I take all I have and give to the poor and give my body over to suffering, but I do not have love, I have nothing. And then that's the famous wedding passage: love is patient, love is kind, it does not boast, it is not proud, blah, blah, blah. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. And then I just looked this up, 1 Corinthians 13 verse 8 says, never fails. Where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. And when I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now we see only a reflection, as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And those three things remain: faith, hope, and love, and the greatest is love. It's hard not to guess. First of all, given who William Penn was, that was absolutely an intentional allusion to the idea of seeing face to face. And then to think of all of the times where Dumbledore says that love is the power that he has, and it's a power that, can imply weakness. But the times where we've talked about childhood and adulthood, about crossing over certain barriers or boundaries or lines into a different world, plus the times where we've talked about prophecy, it's kind of hard not to think that this is like a deliberate allusion to an allusion to this passage, right? I mean, that's right for me at least.
No, I agree. And I like how that passage is translated a little more when it's translated as through a glass darkly, which I don't know if that's the King James Version translation, but that's just, I completely agree that what this book about is putting away our partial seeing or perspective on this series and having the full perspective. And I think part of the dedication is supposed to show us that, and that it is the fullness of the series realized. You see the full form that the particular parts of it have been trying to embody. It's like a connect the dots. And so now we are going to see through the glass with a much fuller perspective. And that it ties also to the idea of looking through a glass and seeing clearly to Dante. The highest heaven that he has, the Empyrean, is actually seen as a reflection of the invisible crystalline heaven. It's like seeing heaven in the same way that you see Dumbledore here. So it is as if, I don't know, Harry has seen a glimpse of heaven, or it is that sort of Freudian mirror. Vera said he's seeing what he wants to see in this moment. But I completely agree that passage seems appropriate, does seem clearly alluded to by Penn and therefore by Rowling. And just something that I think is the strongest piece of evidence is that when he talks about as being as a child, seeing as a child, we don't go back to school in this book. We go out into the world. Now they have to go through sort of a rite entree, a sort of rite of initiation. They have to become mature adults and make mature adult decisions. And it seems like a big part, maybe even the big part of becoming an adult, is realizing that you are finite and that you will die, and having to deal with that and make choices, with this hemorrhaging wound of time. And that, I completely agree.
Right on. Well, I don't know where you guys want to pick up in the actual book, but we should probably get going on that. I don't know. I guess, Sarah, you had some things you wanted to be sure to.
Yeah. I mean, I wasn't thinking necessarily of going chronologically, but I think as I was reading these chapters, in chapter, I think it's chapter 2. I'm sorry. Maybe it's chapter 3. I'm just scanning through my book. Chapter 3, where Harry and Dudley have kind of a moment, and
right.
I think that's important. I mean, he almost has a moment with Petunia as well, but he doesn't, right? And he certainly doesn't have really much of a moment with Uncle Vernon. But I think it's like page 36, 37, maybe even a little bit further. And Dudley offers Harry a handshake. He says, like, I don't think you're crazy. And it's almost like to me, what I saw is sort of like that there's potential for redemption, even in a character who is seemingly unredeemable, who's been a bully, who's been a mean kid, who's been unkind. That there's a way. I think it's like page 40 or 41 or something, where there's a way for there's a glimmer of potential for goodness, for transformation, for redemption, even in someone like Dudley, for whom, he might very well be a rotten kid, but certainly his context has made him worse if he wasn't already kind of like yucky of a kid to begin with. And I think we talked about that a little bit when we were comparing, or at least drawing parallels between Harry and Voldemort's youth. That like Dudley too has a context that's worth keeping in mind, and that here's a kid who can overcome his context. Even if it's too late, even if he and Harry never see each other again, right? There's at minimum a kind of détente, and I don't know. There's he can't really explain it, but they have a moment when they leave, and yet even for Petunia, who maybe has even more of a reason to like soften towards Harry, Lily has Harry has Lily's eyes, and I don't know. She is somehow incapable of saying more than goodbye to him. She, at the end of that chapter, she has that moment where Harry thinks that she was on the edge of speech, but then with a jerk of her head bustled out of the room after her husband, and so on, and son. And I don't know. I think I know for a fact that that's important for a few parallels later. But what did you guys think? Did you anticipate that? What do you think it means? I don't know. What do you think?
I thought that at least a couple parallels do show up pretty quickly, which is in Hermione and Ron both having to think about how they're going to kind of cover for themselves going off. Of course, Harry doesn't have to do it himself, but he does have to persuade the Dursleys that it's important that they leave, right, for their own safety. Hermione does it, of course, through magic, tricks, or enchants rather her parents into thinking that they're someone else and that they have no daughter, right? It's very moving, and they go off to Australia where they'll hopefully be safe. And Ron, of course, has got his ghoul that he's made to look like himself, and he's had help from Fred and George and his dad to try to cover for that, for them not going back to school, right? It's going to be different. Whereas here, yeah, Harry, he tries to persuade them. He tries to tell them. He knows they won't listen. They have to, this thing because of the magical world, and they continue to pretend it isn't real, right? Or that it didn't affect them. That kind of makes me think back to, that idea of maturity consisting in consciousness of death or awareness of mortality, right? Like in some ways the Dursleys are still children then, if they are trying to be blind or to this way that their closeness to Harry Potter makes them vulnerable. And yeah, Petunia, sorry. Petunia seems to kind of realize it there and be on the point of saying something about it. And I thought it was cool that Dudley's the one who actually does articulate it, at least to some extent. In some way, he makes a gesture of reproachment with Harry, and Harry, to his credit, reciprocates. As much as he's had a hard time with the Dursleys, he seems open to the possibility that they have some good in them.
And so, how does that departing scene, which really strikes me as parallel with Dumbledore's sitting down with the Dursleys, the time before that we saw them, how does that juxtapose with the 7 Potters that we then see? I was wondering what that meant exactly, because there's that cliche that said that's running around these days on the internet, that everybody that has a different idea of you, and thus the idea of you is different in everybody, is different in everybody. Everybody has a differing perspective on you. And I was wondering how whether you had some perspective on how that thought ties to each of these people, therefore embodying Harry. Or is this itself sort of like a cheeky clue that Harry is himself a metaphor for the archetypal hero, and anybody can embody him at some given time? What do you think of that juxtaposition? Is it even there?
That's a weird way to think about it. I thought that the contrast they're going for is with the Horcruxes, the 7 pieces of Voldemort, and 7 Harrys. But I mean, it's a pretty bizarre plan all around, right? To have all these people be impersonate Harry Potter. It does seem that Harry's right that this is going to put them all in an inordinate amount of danger. Of course, it turns out real badly for George, and especially for Mad Eye. I don't know. I thought this was such a weird plan for them to. It just seemed so over the top. I don't know. And yeah, I guess I can see that the idea that you'd like embody the hero. They are all willingly doing it, right? They're all of age. They all have chosen this burden. It's kind of sprung on Harry, right? He's not really got a say in the matter. He's rather unheroic looking as a result. Like, it's kind of a strange way for him to to be rescued. It's, of course, in the same flying motorcycle that he was carried in as a baby by Hagrid, right? And I don't know. It's just a really, really odd sequence. I don't know quite what to make of it.
I definitely thought, I read the 7 Harrys as kind of a, like you said, Wes, kind of a contrast to the 7 things into which Voldemort had encased the soul, and that I was struck by a couple things. Number one, even though they looked like Harry, they still talked like themselves. And so what that indicates to me is that appearance is window dressing on a soul, right? Like, that person looks like Harry but is still Fleur, right? So like and that, I think that's when Hermione explains why when you destroy a Horcrux, a piece of soul can't just go into another object. She says that the body is like a human being with a soul is the exact opposite of a Horcrux, right? Like, that the Horcrux needs the body in a Horcrux, the soul needs the body, the object in which it's encased, to even exist. But that the human being, the soul's existence does not rely upon the body, right? Like she says something like, I could stab you with this sword and it wouldn't kill your soul, it would kill your body, right?
Yeah.
And I thought that was like very deliberate to illustrate like what the strengths are of each of these sides. The other thing that I think you brought up, Wes, that I thought was important is that it's all of like the weaker people, the younger, the smaller people who take on Harry's appearance, right? So it's not like Bill doesn't become Harry, Fleur becomes Harry. Kingsley doesn't look like Harry, Hermione does, right? So maybe that's simply for the sake of the plan, but the fact, if you add that with how weak and how foolish he feels when he's sitting in the sidecar, and then ultimately how weakened he feels, like, you know, how weakening that whole experience is, the things that are lost, the moment where he's literally like heading towards the earth in a sidecar that's been separated from the motorcycle, like how that's so enervating. And so, I mean, in traditional like heroics, that's so not heroic what he is looking like. And I just sort of thought it was maybe an attempt to indicate how important what seems like weakness is, and how necessary what weakness provides you, or what imperfection. Weakness is a shitty word for this, but what it provides you, maybe like a better word might be incompletion, or like a privation, an absence, a lack, or something like that.
Passivity.
What it creates is like a recognition that you need other people. Like if you're too strong, or if you're perfectly built, or you are not broken in any way, or you feel like, oh, I got this, then there'd be no reason to reach out to other people and ask them to help, right? But it's
Right.
like it's weakness of some kind, not bad weakness, but weakness nonetheless demands that we build community or alliance or teams of some kind, and that like that's going to be the exact antithesis of the quote unquote community of Death Eaters. They, you know, he wants nothing more than to be so powerful that he doesn't need them, and what he doesn't need his followers, and yet he desperately needs them, and he doesn't understand that. And that, I think, is one of the real like weaknesses in Voldemort's logic, is that he needs people to follow him, but he doesn't want to need them. He wants to make them obsolete. Which is why when he needs someone else's wand, it's so shameful for him to need something from someone else. You know, that's how I read that scene with the 7 Potters, which is why I think when Dudley is the one to, I think Dudley has to be the one of the Dursleys who recognizes that Harry isn't crazy, is because Dudley's the one who's been weakened, like terrified by his encounter with the Dementors, clearly haunted by it. When he's like, oh my God, there are more. And he's also the kid, right? I think there's like a latent political argument here that like adults are beyond saving. Children can be saved. Children can be molded. They can be taught. They can be raised. They can be shaped. They can be formed. But when you're an adult, if you're not formed right, you're kind of fucked. Because you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Like adults are far less likely to recognize their own weaknesses and band together with people. Like adults just fall into their ways, and like stop seeing the world from anybody else's perspective. But kids can do a lot, right? And I think Dudley sort of represents that too. It couldn't be the adults. They're too like set,
And to that point, you're helping me to understand why it is that even though we're receiving all these metaphors of coming to be and becoming mature and embodying the hero and recognizing one's own death and no longer speaking as a child because we're no longer children, we see Harry sort of in reverse, like you two have been saying, that he finds himself in a passive role here in the sidecar that he was in as a baby. So there's a parallel drawn between him being a baby. He takes a passive position. He does not get to ride on a broomstick because that's too indicative of the person he generally is. And Voldemort is capable of using that against him, which we saw in the last book, right? His penchant for heroics almost got people killed. And now you see evil sort of adapting. And I was wondering too, I was like, man, yeah, this is utterly passive. This is so different. But I guess, it's because the good guys, the Order of the Phoenix, are adapting to the fact that Voldemort understands their key player so well. But there's also a contrast as well as the comparison. I totally accept the 7 Horcrux and 7 Harry idea. I think that's dead on. And I would say that there's a big contrast in that Harry has so many people helping him, looking just like him, right? That's what Voldemort can't stand, anybody being like him. And so much so that Harry even relies on somebody else to drive him, someone he puts his full trust in, just like Dumbledore did. Again, that trust element, like you were mentioning, Sarah, like we brought up, that a big difference between Voldemort and Harry is that Harry can accept community and communion and thus be vulnerable with people, whereas Tom Riddle, Voldemort, has always wanted to dominate. But you even see that in their modes of transportation, because now apparently Voldemort can fly just on his own, on like a cloud of smoke. He doesn't even need a broom or anything. And so Harry is like he's so entirely reduced here to this totally passive role in order to just blend in, whereas Voldemort is all the more majestically demonic.
Yeah, the way that he just sort of appears is pretty terrifying. There's also this thing with the wands, right? That his wand casts a spell that he didn't know and he didn't intend to do it in any kind of way. It's different than other times when he sort of like instinctively reacts, and that's kind of what people try to tell him must have happened, but he knows that something weird is going on, and seems that Voldemort knows about it too, and there's something going on with trying to use someone else's wand to get around it, right? Ollivander's in jail, and now Voldemort's heading to find someone called Grigorovich, not to be confused with Gregorovich, the terrible Quidditch player. But like, yeah, there's some weird mechanical issues here, which I think are kind of interesting. Like, we've never really been told what's going on with magic and wands, and like why certain things happen. They happen very abruptly, right? That we'll get sort of like rules thrown out there, things that even wizards don't seem to know about much, right? Aside from Dumbledore, who seems to know pretty much everything. Like the priori incantatem moment, or when, I don't know, Voldemort tries to possess Harry directly and he gets cast out by the pain of love, right? So there's like all these sort of interesting, I guess I just call them like mechanical or technical things going on with magic. And we're going to see, I guess, more about wands and how, Harry's wand seems to know magic that he doesn't. I don't remember quite how that works, but I'm guessing phoenixes are involved.
I have, as you speak, I'm just thinking obliquely about something, and I don't even know if it's really a question at this point, but it was something I talked about with you too in the pre-show, but it's gripped me, and so I wanted to know your perspective. So just a part also of these first 7 chapters is the will of Albus Dumbledore. We meet Rufus Scrimgeour again, and there's something about how Jim Dale performs him that I do like him and his gruffness, even though he happens to be on a different side from me. It's very different from, say, Umbridge, who I loathe entirely, as the would say. It doesn't matter what side she's on. I don't like her, right? But to what extent is Scrimgeour an alternative view of Harry's future, like a differing Bernard of Clairvaux that Dante can move towards as his ultimate ideal, his like figure of embodying God the Father? And to what extent is there a tension between Harry and Scrimgeour? Because Scrimgeour is sort of like the practical man, whereas Dumbledore is like the speculative. That Scrimgeour is himself a most successful representative of a path that Harry could take. Or head of Aurors, head of Ministry of Magic. I mean, what a decorated life. Something I've just been trying to understand is why there is that tension between them. I know obviously Scrimgeour wants to use Harry as a symbol of propaganda and hope, and Harry disagrees with the methodology of Scrimgeour, in particular implicating people who he believes to be innocent, like Stan Shunpike. He thinks that seems to be sort of totalitarian of Scrimgeour or fascist. Is there something in that thought? Is Scrimgeour in some way like, or is that also Harry? Because the other thing that tripped me up is that Harry is going to have to choose a path at some point in his life, like a sort of a mundane career if he survives this book. And then he might work at the Ministry of Magic. And right now he seems to be so famous that he is sort of outside of these distinctions and he doesn't have to make that sort of choice. But at some point, it's not going to be him versus the ministry. Like, he's going to be a ministry employee, ideally as an Auror. And so he won't occupy anywhere near as big a slot of the public eye. And I was wondering if his rejection of Scrimgeour is sort of like a rejection of being, sort of reduced to his role, in the way that, like, being a child with infinite potential, you have to sort of, hedge your bets or sanction off particular futures in order to pursue an actual one. Like, you can't be a doctor, engineer, and lawyer all at the same time. You have to choose one of those paths. I'm sorry, I know it's kind of a weird question, but it just has been gripping me.
Yeah, I think their dynamic is pretty cool. I mean, given that now Dumbledore's gone, now Moody seemingly gone, Scrimgeour is probably one of the top, contenders for most powerful good guy wizard, maybe Shacklebolt or Lupin or someone. But yeah, it's very interesting that he's so strongly cast in the role of the rival, or the oppressor here. I think it's pretty funny how he has like this kind of grudging admiration for Hermione when she like catches him in his technicalities about the will, right? And she knows the exact law that he's been forced to follow, right? At least he followed the law, which is good. And so they got their stuff, but of course not the sword. I find that scene really funny and cool. I like that he burns a hole in Harry's t-shirt, right? And then he feels sort of bad that he like lost his temper. I think Harry totally gets the better of him there. But then Harry's kind of, standing up against Lupin too, right? He's like, believing and trusting everyone there. He doesn't think anyone sold him out. And that's probably foolish, but like, he can't help it. That's the honorable thing to do it. And that there seems to be a kind of vacuum of power really here. And it's up to Harry to kind of stand.
I mean, I don't like Scrimgeour. I don't even know if I'm saying that word properly. I think for the same reasons that Harry doesn't. I think it's really tempting in a position of power to justify small negotiations of principle for an end goal. Like I see him as far more Machiavellian than Dumbledore, right? Like, and I think that the heart of that is like a fear of being weak, right? And I think it's interesting that when did we first see Scrimgeour? He wanted Harry to appear alongside of him so that people would think that the ministry is like strong, right? There's like this, and that's something that like Dumbledore never really cared about, right? He didn't care about appearing strong. Like he, as a side note, I just finished teaching Things Fall Apart, which is a great novel if you haven't read it. But one of the things that Chinua Achebe, and one of the things that we've been talking about, especially in comparing Okonkwo to, say, Creon from Antigone or Joe Keller from All My Sons, or and how they're maybe different from Odysseus, is just how much these men care about how they're perceived, and that when perception is the order of the day, you actually relinquish quite a bit of power over your own sense of success or self-worth to the people whose perception you value, right? Like there's an inherent weakness in caring about reputation, because on the one hand, you want people to think X about you, but on the other hand, you want to control what they think, right? So it's the conundrum that in theology, that theologians feel like God gets over this conundrum by granting free will, right? Like it's not love if you're forced to do it, right? Like and I think for Scrimgeour, what I see is someone who cares about politics more than policy, who cares more about how things appear than how they are. And so like when Harry says like, I don't like your methods, and he refers to the scar that he still has on his hand, because I think the implication is like Umbridge still has a job with you, right? Like you say you're interested in this, but the way that you behave is not a reflection of your values, right? Like, and the problem when you negotiate away and you chip away and you trade away what you say you believe in for what's expedient, is eventually people stop believing you, and you become like the Mitch McConnells of the world, who's only predictable in the sense that he will do whatever it requires for him to be powerful, right? Even if it means saying one thing today that is the exact antithesis of what he said yesterday. And I don't think those people are trustworthy, even if they are predictable. And I really don't like him. And that whole, that the trick that he pulls with the sword of Gryffindor, I think he's like a far step away from Dumbledore. I think in the sense that Dumbledore represents an alternative path for Harry, I don't know that Harry's ever going to be as smart as Dumbledore was, but
it doesn't look like it.
I think, yeah, I think Scrimgeour represents what happens when you prefer the appearance of power or strength or I got this over what's right. You know what I mean? And like in the world, that's a really like the more in the world you are, that's a really tempting choice. And you think like, oh, I'm just going to make this one choice this one time to stay in the game, to stay in the room where it happens, and then over time, to quote Hamilton, if you stand for nothing, what will you fall for? Right? Like, if over time, like if all you're interested in is the acquisition and the retention of power, then I don't know. I feel like that is part of what the modern landscape of politics suffers from. Is not that it's Machiavelli's fault, because I think he just observed something about human nature rather than taught something. But like the I don't know. I see him as a very tempting way to attempt to challenge Voldemort, but ultimately completely not successful. When you negotiate away your identity and who you are in an attempt to win, you lose, I think.
Right. I see. I totally agree that A, he's a Machiavellian. B, that he puts end goal over methodology. But that C, he doesn't realize that that is what the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is, right? Dr. Jekyll is called Doctor because he has a long career of doing good. But Mr. Hyde, because he's just embarked on his career of doing bad. But over time, it becomes harder and harder to go back to Dr. Jekyll, because this is sort of a neurological story and theological, in that the little bad sinful things that you lay with at first, like Lucifer with sin, eventually you do once, then 3 times, then 5 times. You get more and more into them. You spend more and more time dedicated to them. You become less and less your original Dr. Jekyll, just dipping your toe into something, and more this creature that embodies sin. And so I take your point there that Scrimgeour is not to be liked precisely because he has sort of danced with the devil and thus been corrupted by it. And that if Harry is going to be a representation of sort of the logos or the carrier of truth, that he cannot give in to this sort of this demonic figure. Again, another sort of, just as we were talking about how Slughorn is sort of a figure of Belial or the demon of luxury, it seems like Scrimgeour here is sort of like, I can't remember whether it's Moloch or whoever the demon of like propaganda and false speech is. Almost like what people who have, I would say, weak interpretation of the Aeneid think of it as a simple work of propaganda or propagandist. I think that's a small element of it. In any case, I see why you dislike Scrimgeour, because it's like you doubt his integrity, and so I take that point.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also noticed that this theme seems to be starting to come about like waves from an ocean of appearance versus reality. Like we have the ghoul in the pajamas that has to seem like Ron. We have the polyjuice potion that makes all these people seem like Harry. Scrimgeour wants to appear strong, even though he's not actually. And so there's like Stephen Colbert, what is it? Videre quam esse, to seem rather than to be, the opposite of quote, which is esse quam videre. The passive of to see, so to be seen, to be rather than to be seen or perceived in a certain way. And so that's very interesting too, that theme is coming about. Was there some final thought that we wanted to end with today?
Oh, just, R.I.P. Hedwig.
Yeah.
She dies pretty abruptly,
that was tough.
Pretty sadly. It's like it's rough too, because she's like kind of mad at Harry for their last interactions. They don't really get to say goodbye or anything.
She's cooped in her cage. Just to die. Yeah, Sarah.
I loved in that chapter how it's titled like the Fallen Warrior, and it could be about Hedwig or it could be about Mad-Eye. I mean, I think it's supposed to mean Mad-Eye Moody, but I do think that, if Hedwig hadn't been there, Harry would be dead, right? I think Hedwig took a bullet.
Right.
And, I also think, just in light of what has been implied about the snake and the snake's relationship to Voldemort, right? Have I read ahead, or has it been implied that the snake is possibly a Horcrux?
That's been implied, yes. That was a suspicion.
Yeah. So if that's the case, I just think that that's an interesting contrast or parallel. I don't really know if it is a parallel, but just that animal is so crucial to Harry's, entree into the wizarding world. He talks about how when he didn't have any, in times of trial, that Hedwig has been a source of comfort, also a source of access and knowledge. It's how you can get information and how he was able to communicate with people. And I think it's interesting that that both he and Voldemort have this animal to which they are attached, but the way they are attached is radically different. You know, one is, I don't know if that makes any sense, but.
Well, and even just to the distinction you made about the difference between body and soul and Horcrux and soul, there is literally that difference between Harry and
Right.
this ethereal, aerial creature, and Voldemort and this mundane or of the earth terrestrial creature. It is literally a Horcrux for Voldemort. It holds his soul, whereas though it is very tragic that Hedwig dies for Harry, it does not damage his being. And so, yeah. I totally agree. I also am now noticing that there are some parallels back to the first book, the first getting of Hedwig. And of course, seeing that snake as well, who was bred in captivity, and establishing Harry's sort of link to the wizarding world. And in a much less evil or malicious seeming way than Tom Riddle, who also established that connection with snakes early. But that's interesting too. I hadn't been on the lookout for allusions back to the very beginning, but I suppose we might be noticing some of those in these chapters too, just with a very different tone and sort of dark, ominous feeling behind it. And so for next time, where should we read to?
Yeah, I don't know. Like 100 pages or so?
We finished it at the beginning of chapter 8. Do we want to go through? I think if we go through 13, that's a little bit more than 100, Wes, but that would end. That would end like a scene, I think.
Sure. Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, excellent. So 8 through 13, starting with the wedding. Very different. So instead of these tragic elements in death, perhaps we'll see some comic elements. Perhaps we'll see comedy turn to tragedy. Until then, bottoms up, y'all.
All right. Cheers.
Cheers.
Take care. See ya.
You too.